My name's Raymond Otto Pfahl Jr. I was born and raised around Purell, Illinois area. I went to college first before I joined the service and that, but after 3 years of being in ROTC and some of the stuff that they were doing to my future wife, I got pissed off and quit. And so I joined the reserves at that time in August 25th, 1977. And I went to basic in AIT. I went to basic at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and then my AT was at well, it's called Fort Monroe now, but to me it's always going to be Fort Benning. For my AIT, I was an 11 Bravo, or an infantryman. And then after that, going through that, I went through Airborne and Ranger School. And then I went back and continued my degree in college. My wife got a job, we were married then, and my wife got a job in Utah, and I couldn't find a job, so I said, well, I'm going to go back in the service. And so I walked into the recruiter's office. I said, I only have two things. One, I want to go infantry, which I'm already qualified for, and two, I want Fort Carson as my duty station. And the recruiter looks and he says, we got no slots at Fort Carson right now. And I said, well, you got an infantry division there, which the 4th was there. And he said, well, everything's filled up. I said, okay, thank you. And I got up. Just about the time I hit the door, he goes, oh, wait a minute, something just popped up. Because I had a good friend there that was the first sergeant to a unit, and I'd already talked to him and said, if I could get there, could I get in where he was at? Because he was in ROTC with us. And he said, sure, I'll check with the colonel and everything. So when I got there, then I went in with him and that. And we spent probably 3 weeks, and then we went to Panama for jungle training and spent 3 weeks down there going through jungle training and that. So then we got back, and I got moved from an actual line company to the headquarters company, and I was the battalion ammo officer, basically, and I kept track of all the ammo, whether it be our combat load, should we need it, and or the ammo that the units would use to fire their weapons and their mortars and things of this nature, So then one day I come into work and there's this big pile of paperwork on my desk, and I'm going, what's this about? And we had an old E7, and he looks at me and he said, Pfahl, he said, you're too intelligent to be in infantry. And I looked at him and I said, okay. He says, that's your packet for OCS, sign it. And I said, oh, okay. So I signed it. And a couple weeks later or so, I went back to Fort Benning to go through OCS. And then after OCS, I graduated, was commissioned to second lieutenant, in ordnance, which I wanted, which I thought would never really happen since I already was an 11 Bravo qualified. I figured they'd put me back in infantry. So I went to my basic course, which was at Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. And there we learned how to handle the different sections that were in the Army's maintenance side. You know, we did a little things on how the tanks and what they all had to go through. And at that time, the Bradley was just new. And we did that. Matter of fact, we even took a Jeep engine apart, which I asked the instructor, I said, why would I have to, as an officer, take apart a Jeep engine? I said, the only reason I could think of was if everybody was dead or gone. I said, and I was the only person left, you know, that, you know, an officer really doesn't, you know, because he's got warrant officers that help him out, and then he's also got then the senior NCOs and things of that nature. And so, you know, I got through that. Well, then they had this one section that we went through, which was called recovery. And in there, they have 2 units, well, 3 units, really. They got the recovery people that would go out and recover a damaged tank or Bradley and that, and then pull it back to where it can be worked on. And that if we couldn't work at it right there in the area. And so they had this old, I'll never forget him, he's called Chief Murphy. He was a CW3, and he was telling, he goes, I bet there's nobody in here that knows what the service and support section is. And I kind of raised my hand, and I said, Chief, I know what you're talking about, because I've been there, done one, you know. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm a machinist and welder through the reserves and everything. And he goes, okay. So then at one of our breaks, he comes up to me, taps me on the shoulder. He goes, Lieutenant, he says, the chief of the area, and I can't think of what it was right off the top of my head, wants to talk to you. And I thought, okay, what did I do wrong? You know? And so I went in and talked to Major Brown, and you know, he asked me questions about my welding and my machinist and that, because I already had orders to go to Korea after getting done with my basic course. He said, would you consider staying here and being a division chief for my welding side? I said, well, if you can get it to happen, sir, yeah. And he did. So I spent 3 years, about a year and a half of it was at the welding side. We trained Army, Marines, and Air Force people through different types of welding, plus the Army got a special thing where they did, and I think the Air Force did too, where we did body work for like fender work and stuff of this nature, of putting things back and that. And then we lost the chief of administration, and then we also lost the officer for the machine shop. Well, I already had a chief in the welding section, and there was no chief for the machine section. So the major moved me over, and I was kind of both the admin officer plus then the chief of machinist in that. And again, we trained their Army, Air Force and Marines to be machinists and that. We were what's called a DOD school. So it wasn't just an Army school, basically. We were, like I said, we had all three different services and that. And the only reason why we didn't have the Navy there, as your previous person says, we didn't do any pipe welding and things like that, you know. So, and that's what they needed to be certified in the in the Navy and that. I got out right after that. My enlist, or I would say, my, I guess you could say it was somewhat of enlistment because I had 3 years and that, and so we moved back to Colorado and that, and then because my wife was also an officer, and that's kind of how we met. We kind of had both the same degrees, so we had a lot of classes together, plus we were both in ROTC and that. Well, she had gotten a job when I was stationed there working on the new Abrams tank with General Dynamics and that. So she was a lot of times behind the fence, as we called it, because that's where all the top secret stuff was going on in that, you know. And so sometimes it'd be late at night and I couldn't call her or she couldn't tell me, you know. She just had to be working because they were testing something on it. But she got a real big kick out of it because they had a tank go down that it put a hole through the armor. And this is specially graded armor that they have on the M1. And there was nobody, because their welder had went to back home for a leave and that. And there was nobody else in the area there. And so they called out to anybody. Well, there was only 2 people on the whole post that was able to do that. One of them was a sergeant of mine that worked in the welding and was me. So we went back and she looks at me and she goes, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I come because I hear you need a welder." And she goes, "Well, yeah, we do." And I said, because you had to have 2 people. You had to have one watching him what he was doing, and then the other one, and they both had to have secret clearances. And me and him had the secret clearances and that, so he did the welding while I watched him. So then I got out and went into the civilian workforce, and between that and the service, you know, I spent 39 years and 10 months in the service before I retired, because an officer can go a lot of times farther than what enlisted men can or want to. And I've got about 30 years in, about 40 years now in the civilian side, where I was a quality engineer in aerospace for 10 years, and then 30 years I've been a quality engineer manager in the medical device companies and stuff like that. So, you know, if you need something to be replaced, or if you broke your leg or your arm, I probably know what's going in it. So that's kind of my background. Like I said, I was in the first Gulf War. And it wasn't too bad for me because we basically followed the Brads and the M1s around fixing them or pulling them back and that. When I went into Bosnia, it got a little worse because of the fact is that you'd go from one place to another and you'd go into a town, small town, and you knew it was Bosnian because, you know, the houses were all up and stuff. And the next town you go through, it looked like scenes you'd seen from World War II with half buildings and all that, and you knew that was a Muslim town, you know, because they just blew the heck out of it and everything, you know. And, you know, and so that kind of got to you because you're looking and these people were, you know, trying to live in their house, but they didn't have a roof over it or 4 walls even on some of them and that, you know. And then I went and was reclassified into civil affairs when I went to Iraq in 2006 and 7. And that was a shock. I mean, one of the things I worried about was the fact is that after World War II, the government said to the Germans that anybody that was in the Nazi party couldn't help run the country. So then they had a big you know, trying to get the country back up, you know. And MacArthur, when he took over in Japan, he didn't abide by that. He knew that the people that knew how to run the business, even though they may have been involved with the former regime and all that, they had the knowledge to run the country, and that's why he allowed them to be. When we were in Iraq, the same thing happened. Anybody that was part of the Ba'ath Party couldn't hold an office at the time. Well, they were the only ones that knew because by then most of their brain power had already left the country many years ago and stuff, you know, because of Saddam Hussein. And, you know, it was hard for us, I should say, because going around to different little towns and having a date farmer and that be the mayor of a town and trying to get him to understand what his job was, what he was to do, how to handle his budgets and things like that, because, you know, I mean, everybody came up to him and they wanted this fixed, that fixed, you know, and we'd tell them, okay, you only got so much money coming from the government. And because of that, you got to prioritize what you're going to do first, you know. Then maybe next year when you get your new budget, you can, you know, fix these things farther on down your list and that, you know. But you can't fix them all at once because you don't have enough money to do it, you know. And then plus with the bank system being destroyed, basically, the only way we could pay them was I carried the money around to pay them. and several times I had over $2 or $3 million in my backpack because I had to go to several different places and that, you know, and that. So, you know, I mean, I guess that kind of, you know, got. And the fact is then, you know, the foreign fighters got going pretty good when I was there. And, you know, we had several attacks on us. I lost 4 guys out of my company due to IEDs and that. And so, you know, it was a good time, but in a sense it wasn't so good, you know. Well, for me, it wasn't too hard because my first job I worked for Martin Marietta, which is now Lockheed Martin. And so my first job for 6 months was to review welding certs and everything. But, you know, it still wasn't. You had to watch people because they weren't as motivated to do jobs and things like that. And so being a quality person, you know, we were kind of considered cops, so nobody really wanted to talk to us when we come down on the floor and that, you know. So you had to kind of win their respect, and which I did because, you know, I told them that I was a machinist and had been a welder in the service and that, you know, and so they a lot of times then would talk to me about, you know, what was going wrong and maybe how to fix it, and then I could take that back up and say, hey, have you thought about doing this? Or, hey, we need to change this work instruction to do this because that's what they're doing and not, you know, what you think they're doing and everything. But you know, I've been in a regulated business since I got out of the service, and, you know, a lot of people don't realize, especially with the FDA, well, even with the aerospace, I mean, because most of them were government contracts that they were doing and stuff, you know, and they could shut it down if things got out of hand, you know. But, you know, with the FDA, they could come in and close the plant down. And, you know, I've had a couple friends of mine who've been there when the marshals come in heavily armed and closed the place down and told all the employees to leave, you know. And that. Now, I've been with a company that got caught not having proper procedures and stuff like that, and they got fined like $1.5 million because of it, you know, and that. And so, you know, these guys, when you're looking and putting something into the body of a patient, they want to make sure it's going to work and everything as you say it should work due to your research and development of that particular item. You know, the thing I look at is the fact is that, you know, as we get up in years, even though we may have a problem that didn't surface while we were in the service, but it still contributes from the service. You know, like my knees, my back, you know, from being airborne and doing all the running that we did in the service and that, you know, I mean, they've taken a toll. Well, at the time that I got out, you know, they didn't hurt, you know, but now as I'm getting older, they're hurting and things like that. And, you know, they have to take a look at that. And, you know, I'm very grateful that we got the pack through, you know, because I was in several different places where, you know, we either had burn pits going and you could smell them and that, or when I was in Kuwait, you know, they still had the oil fires going and stuff. I mean, where we were billeted in Saudi, I mean, at night you could see the flames, you know, when it got dark and that, you know, and so depending on which way the wind was blowing, you'd get that smoke and that from the fires and stuff of that nature, you know. And So, and then I had colon cancer in 2018. Luckily, they caught it in time, and so all they did was remove that section of my intestine and put it together again. I didn't have to have any of the chemo treatments and that. They got it all and that. So, but I get tested just about every year to make sure, you know, it doesn't return and that. So, and, you know, I mean, it's our government, you know, and, you know, looking back at some of the things that has happened, and you wonder, okay, where was the Inspector General when these guys and gals were getting their bonuses because they had flubbed the paperwork to make them look good than what they were and that, you know. And so I think that, you know, in the field that I was in the medical devices, that would have been a criminal act, and you would go to jail for it, you know. I mean, if you put stuff down that didn't really happen, and I'm surprised that some of these guys didn't, you know. They just moved them to a new area, basically, from what I've read and everything. The fact is that once the war was over in Iraq, and I'm going to say this, the big army didn't know what to do, okay, with itself. I mean, you know, I supported the 4th there for a while, and then I supported the 1st Cav when they came in. Now with the 4th, you know, the colonel of the brigade, you know, really couldn't come up with anything in his efficiency report other than, well, I built so many schools or I built so many hospitals, but we kept telling him, sir, they don't need them right now. You know, they don't have in the pipeline teachers to fill those schools. They don't have doctors and nurses to fill those hospitals yet. It's going to be 2 or 3 years before. So then they build them, and then, you know, they either sit empty and all the stuff that were put in them were stolen, you know, by the locals and everything like that, and they resold them on the black market probably and things of that nature, you know. And then, you know, then the foreign fighters would get in them and have their bases and stuff, you know, and so then we'd have to go back out and clear them out and everything, you know. But, you know, there's never been a go-between because of the fact we were all considered special operations. Civil affairs used to be part of the Green Berets, and then they branched it off right after, I think, Vietnam to its own branch, basically. But we still come under the special ops, which, you know, includes the SEALs, the Rangers, Special Forces, us, and then the para-commanders from the Air Force, and that they all come under one command now, where before they were all under their own separate branch and that they had, and that, you know. So, you know, there's still a lot of training to do there to get big Army to understand what we do and that to what the big Army does and things of this nature, you know.